Welcome to this video demo on DevOps on the Microsoft platform. Today we'll build out a deployment pipeline using some of the latest Microsoft tools in the space. The deployment pipeline we'll build out today is an automated implementation of normal build, deploy, test, release, and monitor functions that you would commonly build out for a modern application. In this case, we'll be using Visual Studio Team Services and Azure Platform as a Service to host our app. More specifically, we'll walk through configuring continuous integration for the sample application, adding unit test and validation to the CI process, adding continuous deployment with release management in VSTS, where we'll provision the infrastructure in Azure with ARM templates and use a .NET Core sample app. We'll add an automated performance test to the pipeline, add promotion to production once we've validated using this test, and then send some feedback to a Slack channel when we complete. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll go to the home page for Visual Studio Team Services, and you can see I've already authenticated, and I have my list of existing projects that shows up. So I'll go ahead and create a new project by clicking on New Project. And I'll add a project name. In this case, my sample app is called Voter Information, so I'll create the project name Voter Information App. I'll select Team Foundation Version Control in the selection, and then I'll provide a description. Once I'm ready, I'll click Create. It'll only take a second to create my project for my app. Okay, now my project's created, and you'll see that I have a number of options here. This is just the home screen. I'll click on the Build and Release tab up on the very top, and click around a little bit. You'll see builds, releases, library, various other things. In this case, I'm going to be focusing on the build section first. So first, I'm going to show you this app, this sample app that we'll be using. Again, I referred to the name before, Voter Information. I'm going to open that up in Visual Studio. And this is a fairly simple, straightforward .NET Core app. Uses ASP.NET MVC as the front end and a couple of small assemblies to do the various other pieces of work that it needs to do. I'll build that quickly just to make sure my source is still compiling. And then I'll run it locally just to make sure the app is still executing as I thought it would. So here we'll get to, I'll just walk through a quick demo of the sample app. We'll get to the start page where we're going to enter an address that we want to look up to get information about an upcoming election or the voter information for a person that lives at this residence. Very simple app again. So I click search. It goes out to an external API, gets information specific to that address, and figures out the polling location, gets a list of representatives down below and their contact information. And then provides a link to some of the various communication channels to get to those representatives for the individual user. So very simple app, essentially 2 pages built in .NET Core. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to associate my project to the source code, or the source code to the project I've just created in VSTS, and check it into source control under that project namespace. So in Visual Studio, I'm just going to set up the project connection here, connect to my team project. In this case, I already have a connection to the Team Foundation server, and so I'll just select the project that I've just created. And now you can see it shows up in my list of connections. And now I'll be able to go down and select my project to associate all of my Visual Studio files with for source control. Once that's complete, I'll be able to open up Source Control Explorer, tab down, and I see my project source right there in the Source Control Explorer. So we'll see that over on the portal side on the web page in a second as well. I'll go ahead and check in, do the initial check-in to the source control repository. Provide a comment here. One thing I'm going to do here is exclude my app settings file from source control on the initial check-in. I just don't want my connection string saved in source control. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we get into the actual deployment later on down the line. So I'll check in. And I should now see all those files showing up in the correct folder in VSTS. And again, I'm just going to remove the app settings file from source control. So now if we go back over to the web page and just click on the code tab up at the top, we'll see that my project source is in there, the various folders are there as well, just like we saw through the Visual Studio plugin. And now it's time to create a build definition so we can get some continuous integration going. So I'll click Build and Release, and then New Build Definition. And you'll see I have a number of templates I can start with over on the right to set up my initial continuous integration build. I'll scroll down, and there's one here that's of interest, ASP.NET Core Preview. So I'll click and create that, give this thing a name, and if you notice also while I'm typing this, over on the left side there's a number of tasks in the overall process for this build that we'll need to look at and configure. There's variables, triggers for the build, what kicks it off, various other options which we'll work through. But first, let's take a look at the tasks. I'll save and queue this build and just kick off an initial build where I'll select a couple options here. I'll use the hosted build agent. That means the agent that's provided by the service. I'll queue it up, and we'll see what happens. So it'll go through the process of acquiring the agent from the service. And it's acquired the agent, and now it's running through, kicking off an initial build. And it gives you some visual output from the shell here. It's used my default source control repository for the project. It's gotten the source. It's doing a restoration of the source, of all the source files it needs. And then when that completes, we'll finish up by actually building the source, running through the test task, which is blank at this point, so it'll just kind of a stand-in for that, and then it'll publish it to a location where the agent can access it. So the agent will then be able to use it for things down the line, such as releasing that code, etc. We'll publish the artifact and then do any kind of post-processing cleanup that we need to. There's tasks in for that. But if we click back over to the portal, we'll see that we have some feedback on that build. Notice that it gives me a build number, how long it ran for. It'll give me some test results if there are any. Give me any issues that were found. as I said, define a build number. So let's go back and click edit the build definition and get something a bit more sophisticated in place for our pipeline. First, we'll disable this .NET Core test activity, and we're going to add a new test activity. In this case, we're going to use Visual Studio Test. And this way, we're going to integrate some of our unit tests that are there in our project as a gate for our build, or at least to give us feedback on the build as it compiles every time. So I've selected the Visual Studio Test task. I'm going to give it a new name. In this case, the test assembly, this is a little bit of configuration for a project.json based .NET Core app. So the assembly it'll be looking for, actually we'll be looking for a project.json file just based on the .NET Core app. I'll go down a bit more and do a couple other configuration items for the Visual Studio Test task. In this case, your agent, since I'm using the hosted agent, it works, but your agent has to have the Visual Studio Test Runner on it. And these are a couple of the options that you need to also provide to this task specific. So those are good now. It's going to scan for my unit tests, if there are any, and execute those as part of the build, as part of my pipeline. I should say scan for unit tests that are part of the solution that's checked in. I'm going to use the hosted build agent still, like I said, and that's kind of important because I need the Visual Studio piece. If you're doing your own agent, you'll need to have the Visual Studio Test Runner present. Okay, so why don't we click back over to our project in Visual Studio, and actually to get some unit tests in there, I'm going to add a unit test project that I've already configured. I've built a couple tests for my solution. So add existing project to my solution, and then I'm going to add that project to source control. And then once that's done, I'm just going to test it and make sure my unit test is still executing properly. And you can see my first simple unit test work there. Maybe run one more just to make sure. And now I'll check in my unit test project so that my continuous integration build will be able to use those unit tests in the build process itself. So now if we click back over to the VSTS portal, we'll see in our build process and our unit test task, we'll be able to test actual execution of that unit test project we just checked in just by queuing a new build since we've configured that task to run. So provide any information that you need for input. In this case, I'll use the defaults again, and I'll queue a new build. And this process will be much like the one we just saw in the first step. So I'll pause recording until that completes, and then we'll look at the build results with our unit test execution. Okay, so now our build is completed. You can see we've gotten some output actually from the run unit test task, and you can see each one of the tests that it executed and some low-level logging information about success or failure of that. And also I wanted to highlight back over on the build summary screen, you can see now we're getting test results in that section, and we can drill into that a bit more and see some more details around those tests that have executed. Obviously for a more extensive project you'd want a full unit test suite. In this case I just have 5 unit tests. At this point let's edit the build definition again real quick and actually work on making this a continuous integration build. I've been referring to it as that, but so far been manually queuing it. Let's work with the triggers up at the top and actually execute this build on every time a source file is checked in to source control. I do that by clicking on the Triggers tab on the top and simply just going down to this dial and clicking Enable under Continuous Integration. There's some additional settings I can set inside of that, including the path filters and some other options. But essentially all I need to get that going is to enable this Continuous Integration Radio button under the Triggers option. I'll save that build definition and add it and add a comment. And at this point, all the pieces that we've seen so far, including restoring source, executing the build, integrating with unit tests, should all kick off as soon as I check a project in. So I'll do that now. Here I'll just make a quick change to one of my unit tests here, just so we can see it in action. I'll check that in. And then the service will pick up that there's been a check-in, and we'll queue a new build. And you can see it's already in progress here. It'll be in the queue for the agent to pick up. You can see my third build there is in progress using that branch, the main branch. If I click on that build itself, that's where I get back to this screen where I can monitor the progress of the pipeline itself. And now we have a functional continuous integration build. You can see that one executed successfully as well. Here's my summary. On that build, I have a timeline of the task that we've talked about. The artifact, that's the drop location where the agent can get it, and get the compiled source. My tests we've mentioned. So back to the summary screen. So now we've gone through that process of setting up a continuous integration build. But now let's talk about how we continue that pipeline by deploying the output of that build to a test environment. And I'm going to use release management inside of VSTS to deploy an environment to Microsoft Azure. In this case, I'll be using the Azure App Service, and specifically a web app. So I'll go to Releases and then click on Add a New Definition. And you can see here we also, again, have a bunch of templates for an actual release definition. So a bunch of process steps that will handle the deployment for me. I'm going to start with an empty definition actually and use some of the pre-canned steps, add them manually, just so we can see that process. But I'm going to select my project here from source control. I'm going to use my build as the input to this release definition. And I'll click Create. And again, I'll use the hosted agent. And in that case, it's the hosted release agent. And I'll add my first task to my release pipeline here. So in this case, I'll go down and you see there's a bunch of tasks dealing with Microsoft Azure. In this case, I'm going to use the Azure Resource Group deployment. I'll click Add and close that, and then I'm going to do some configuration. So the setup here is that I want to actually provision the resources for the environment ahead of deploying the bits that have come from my build. So I can use an Azure ARM template in this task to template out or stamp out the infrastructure I'm going to need in Azure. I have a ARM template that I'll show you, which I'll check into source control as well. This is that concept of infrastructure as code in action here. So I'm walking through the steps here of setting up the Resource Manager service endpoint. So essentially my connection to Microsoft Azure, my service credentials, there's the Azure subscription I'll use. It'll make me authenticate here. I'll complete the authentication, then it'll cache these credentials for further use. You can also use a service principal here if you don't want to use a individual account. And for those of you that know Azure, you can use a service principal is essentially a service account with a role assignment that you can use in place of an actual user account. And there's a separate authentication mechanism for that, so you can use that process as well. Great, so I've set up my service endpoint to my Azure subscription. I'll specify the resource group in Azure that I want to deploy to. Let me refresh this. And there's my service connection, my resource group, and then I'll select a location. And here's where I'm going to specify my ARM template, my ARM template. So in this case, for this setup, what I want to do is have the entire infrastructure for the project also checked into source control, so that as I tweak that and make changes there, those changes will apply on the infrastructure needed in the environment as well. So I've set up an ARM template that I'll also add to source control here. And it's a very simple one with an app service, a Redis cache, and a storage account, which is what my app needs. There's the ARM template. And I've just added in a folder called infrastructure so that I'll be clear and in my release definition, so I'll know where to look. So again, one of the benefits to this infrastructure as code is if I make a change to this ARM template, check that in, I'll kick off an automatic build and deployment of the entire environment. So approaching the continuous delivery front. Okay, so back over to release management. Once we've checked in our ARM template, we need to actually create an artifact source here in release management. So that'll give us one place that we can point as configuration to say, get some artifacts from this location. In this case, I'm just going to point back to my source control repository in my project. So I've linked that artifact source, and so when I go back over into the environment and that task, I should be able to select that template from my artifact source. So there's my linked artifacts now showing up, source control, and then there's that infrastructure folder I told you about, and there's my JSON ARM template there. So I'll select that as the template to deploy. That template requires a few sort of simple parameters, which I'll add here. And then I'll leave the default selection for the deployment mode to incremental, meaning that as I redeploy over top of the resource group with the ARM template, it'll make the incremental changes as opposed to replacing all. So I'll save that pipeline for now, that release pipeline, and give it a comment. And we'll take a look at what it looks like once we execute just that first version of our release definition. I'll go up to the release drop-down, select create a new release, specify some information, including which version of which build I should use, which change set I should use in the release. In this case, I'm actually not even going to be releasing the bits at this point. I'm just going to be deploying that ARM template to my Azure subscription. So we'll take a look at what that looks like after the fact. So you can see I've created my new release. It started executing, and it's in progress now. And I can monitor the detailed execution of this release by clicking on the Logs tab up above. And you can see, again, much like the build, we get the steps over on the left side, and then the output from the console, essentially the PowerShell console that's running on the agent on the right. That gives us some progress, gives us the progress, actually, the detailed progress about what's happening. So that's completed. Now why don't we go over to the Azure portal and take a look at our infrastructure and make sure it got provisioned properly into our resource group. So there's the Azure portal. There's my resource group I linked to off of my dashboard there. And inside of that resource group, I should see an app service as well as my Redis cache there. Yep, there's my web app. I've also got a staging slot available there for the web app and my storage account. I've clicked on the Redis cache here so you can see that's up and running. There's my web app, the production slot. There's my web app URL. Staging slot, which I'll use for the test environment I mentioned. We'll first deploy there here in a second. There's my staging URL. And my storage account and the app service plan. So all the things I need for this app to have a full-on environment. It's a very simple app, but still you can see the Redis cache, the Azure App Service, the slots. There's my production URL for now, and then my staging URL I'll show in a second. All this was set up in that ARM template, so very useful to be able to set up both production and test environments and template and stamp them out based on our release. So you can see I have two URLs, nothing's been deployed there yet. So let's hop back over to release management and click on our build definition and edit this a bit more, add some more steps to make it a bit more useful. So first what I'll do is actually edit the name of this release definition to give it a bit more descriptive name. I can also rename the actual environment, so I can add multiple environments that I'm deploying to and with their own associated tasks. In this case, I'm just going to have the one environment I'm deploying to. I'll just call this my Azure environment for now, but I just wanted to highlight that you can have multiple environments that you release to. And then I'll add another task here. And again, from the task catalog, there are a number of different predefined tasks you can use, as well as scripting tasks where you can write custom script. And in this case, I'm going to ultimately add a Azure App Service deploy, but you can, as you can see, you can do PowerShell, SSH, various other scripting tasks as well if you need something custom. So select the Azure App Service deploy, and we'll provide some additional configuration here. I'll just rename this to something I can recognize. I'll select my Azure subscription, again back to the subscription I set up earlier. The app service name, so you can type that in or you can provide an existing one that's in the subscription. I'll select the resource group where that app service lives, and then I'll select the slot to which I want to deploy to. In this case, I'm going to use the staging slot. What I want to do is deploy a test environment that I can run tests on or allow access to before releasing to a production environment. So in this case, I'm just going to be first releasing this build to the staging slot, which I'm calling my test environment for now. So I'll save this, give it a comment. Make sure my configuration is right. And actually here what I want to do is I can add an output variable here. So I'm going to give it the variable name, but this is important in case I want to use this URL further on down the line. And I'll have another task I'll add in a minute, which will use this staging URL as output from this task and it's as input for its own tasks. You'll see why I need that in a minute, but the output of this task will be that staging URL that we looked at earlier, stored in this staging URL variable. Great, so that's set. And we'll use the package from our build, the default working folder, already set. And then we'll create a new release now. Again, we'll choose the build and the change set that we want to use. We'll click create and queue another release. So if all goes well, this should result in another ARM deployment over top of what we've done, as well as the deployment of my web app to my Azure App Service, in this case the staging slot. Again, we'll go up and we can monitor the logs here. You can see that's run through successfully. So now I'll go to the URL for my staging slot, my test environment, and now you can see we have our app has been deployed to Azure. We'll give it a quick test to make sure. Everything's functional. And yes, that's the case. So what's happened here, again, to sum that part of it up, is that we've deployed not only the app to Azure App Service, but the underlying infrastructure over top of it into a test environment. In this case, it's the staging slot of our app service. If we go over to our production URL, you can see there's still nothing there, right? So we've only deployed to our staging slot at this point. This pipeline will go on to doing some additional testing on the staging environment before deploying to our production environment. So we'll take a look at that now. So it's a pretty common use case to want to test against your staging environment ahead of promoting to production. So in this case, I want to show you how you can do a quick performance test of your app, in this case in the staging slot with release management. So I'll choose another task. You see there are a few. There's a cloud-based load test here. There's a quick web performance test. I'll choose this one just to keep it as simple as possible. I'll choose this test, and what it's going to do is validate the performance of my app on staging ahead of my last task, which will be promotion of that app to production. This can be more complicated load tests. This could be UI tests with something like Selenium or coded UI tests in Visual Studio. All these, a full test suite could be built out ahead of doing this production, and in the real world, that's what you'd actually want to do. In this case, I'm doing this simple performance test. I've added that task. Now I'll go through configuring that. And if you look at the website URL I'm putting in here, this is the output from the previous task stored in that staging URL variable, which is common for the environment. And so I'll add that as my website URL. I'll give the test a name, and then specify a couple settings here. I'll just use the default, but essentially it's going to run with a load of 25 users for 60 seconds. And then I'm going to give it my the connection to my VSTS instance, in this case the one that we're in for the load test minutes that it'll use. This is a hosted load test service. Once I have that configuration right, I'll save that.
And if you look what's happened right after I've clicked save, you can see my VS team service connection is blanked out. So what I'll have to do is actually, instead of typing that, register that as a connection. So I'll click manage. That'll take me over to my endpoints again. I'm going to create a new endpoint. In this case, I'm going to use a generic endpoint. And these are some hoops that you have to jump through that you probably shouldn't in this case, but being that you're in the VSTS namespace already. But I'll provide this generic connection. I'll click OK. And now that should be available in my release definition. So I'll go back to my release definition, go back to that task configuration. Not now for LastPass. And it should show up in the drop-down yet. So there it is. And I'll use that connection to VSTS, the VSTS load test service, and save again. And I'll create another release and watch the task executing to this point. So again, ARM template deployment of my app to staging, and then a kickoff of this performance test, this 1 minute 25 user performance test. And the cool thing is that you can set metrics here. I won't show that in this video, but you can set metrics to how well the app should perform if it passes the test to continue on through the release pipeline. And so now my test is completed. We'll scroll down through the logs here, and you can see that my quick perf test has executed, and here are some of the details about the load test run details, which I'll use here. I'll click up in the test page, or on the test tab here, and go to the load test tab, and I should see my test run listed in this list of load tests as well. So there's my quick performance test, and I can go into the details of this load test to get information about response time, user load, and this is actually more useful when you have a sort of more sophisticated load test. In this case, I'm just simply doing a 25 user ping test as we talked about before. So now I've got all the pieces in place up to the point of release into production. So I'm going to show you that here about how we can swap slot. I've clicked on my build and release tab. I'm going to edit that continuous deployment release definition again. So I'll click on the ellipse and go edit. And then I'm going to add another task to swap slots on the Azure App Service here. As I showed before, I have my process deploying to staging. And so I'll add this after my performance test so that we'll swap the deployment that's in staging with production once our performance test runs and is validated. So I've added that task. I'll rename that task to something more meaningful here. And then I'll need to do some configuration around this task as well. So again, hook it up to my Azure subscription I showed before. Indicate the app service name. Set the resource group. The source slot, this is the slot that should be swapped from, and I'll click OK. And now we should have everything we need to test this. So again, walk through that entire process of a build, deploy, to staging, initial performance test, and then swap it out and look at that in production. So I'll create a new release to test that. And it's kicked off here, just on the fact that I've created a new release for that release definition. And I'll take a look at the logs and watch this happen. So my release is run through now. You can see that last step is happening now. You can see in the log it says it's requesting a swap for the slot for my web app as the last step. And once that's complete, as we show here, you can see in the logs my deployment has been updated to reflect some changes on both the staging and the production slots here at the various URLs. So that's in my logs I can use. So if I go back over to my browser here, if I look at my production URL, now I have my deployment up and available. I also have my staging environment. You can see that the deployment has moved from staging to production, so I no longer have a valid URL in staging. That's the deployment has been moved over to the production slot. So that's great. I can manually execute this release when I want to, but now I want to actually start using this release for continuous deployment. So I'll go back into the definition, go to triggers, and simply check this continuous deployment checkbox, and then it'll get me to indicate what my trigger will be, my artifact source, and that'll just be my CI build I've set up previously. So I'll select that, give it a comment here. And by the way, I could have indicated that this should be released on schedule as opposed to the target of a CI build. And click OK. And so now, on build, a successful build, I should also trigger my release. So we'll give that a test. We'll test this by going back into Visual Studio into our project, and we'll make a very small change to our .NET Core app here and check it in and watch the process execute all the way through. So in this case, I'll just go to the layout and change the copyright text at the bottom, and we'll watch that get deployed to staging, run through the test, and then promotion to production, and then the production deployment will move back into the staging slot. That would be the progression of tasks. So I'll change the text here. We should see that. That's what should be reflected at the end of our process. I'll go ahead and check in. Give it a comment. And now if you go back into Team Services, go over to Builds, we'll just open that in a new tab. You can see we will have kicked off a new CI build to start with. And now it looks like my build's completed. Look at the logs and the summary pane. Now if we go back over to my releases and I refresh that list, I'll see I have another release here, release 5, that will have been triggered by the fact that my CI build completed successfully. So here it is. I've clicked on the tabs. I'll look at the logs again, and you can see my process is starting. It's starting to initialize the agent so it can run through the rest of the tasks. And in fact, it looks like it's made it through the staging slot deployment. So we'll go over and take a look at that. Why don't we refresh it? It's done the staging deployment. It's also doing my performance test itself. So you can see my new staging deployment's done. There's my text that's been updated. If I go over to production, you can see there's the old text, the original deployment. And if I check back over in Team Services, yep, looks like my release has been completed along with the promotion to production as the last step. And it gives me the URLs there. So if I go back, now what I should have is in production when I refresh is the updated copyright text showing up. Yep, and there it is. And then in staging, I should have the old copyright text as the deployment from production has been swapped back into the staging slot. And this is kind of standard functionality for the Azure App Service, Azure, web apps. Yep, and there it is. And the last thing I want to illustrate here is how simple it can be to notify some of your internal systems upstream, give some feedback on how either your CI, your CD, or both, how they're doing. So I've created a Slack team for this, and I have a thread, or a channel, I'm sorry, called Team Services. I've generated a webhook in Slack. I won't show that here, but I'm going to use that webhook within VSTS to send a notification over to Slack so that my team members could potentially be notified by about the fact that a build has been deployed and released. So I have to, in the Service Hooks tab, I have to create a new subscription, and you can see Slack is one that I can choose from. I'll choose that, and then I have a number of triggers which I can choose that would initiate posting to Slack. I give it that Slack webhook URL that I mentioned I generated earlier here. I'll test that, and you can see in my Slack channel that I have a message, and I'll finish it. And you can see my event in this case was that the build completed. I'll also do one on release completed as well. There's my webhook. I'll test it one more time, and yep, connectivity is fine. And finish. And so now I should get 2 notifications as soon as I check something into Visual Studio. One for my successful build and one for my successful release. So again, I'll make some edits to that same file at the same area just to demonstrate that. Give it a comment, and I'll check in. And now my build has succeeded. My release is underway, by the way. If I come back over to Slack, you can see my new notification tells me that this build with this build number is completed successfully. I can click on that directly from Slack to go to the summary page for the build, in which I can click around and get more detail. And now I'll click back over to my Slack team, and you can see, yep, my release has now succeeded. I've gotten that notification. Again, there's a hyperlink in that notification I can click on and drill into to see the detail of that release. Look at the logs as we're used to doing by now. And now if I go back over to my production URL, I should see that change reflected because it's been deployed. So yep, that's happened. And so just to review, we've built a CI/CD pipeline with the latest Microsoft tools in Visual Studio Team Services, where we started with a .NET Core app that had not been associated to source control yet. We added a continuous integration build with unit tests. We added release management and deployments to Azure Platform as a Service, along with some simple performance tests. And then we showed integration using webhooks in this case with upstream systems to send feedback and notifications about your CI/CD process. I hope you found this useful. Thanks very much.